Today we are going to look at the Renaissance period. Last week we looked at the Middle or the Dark Ages, which was a transition period after the Roman Empire had fallen. So today we're going to look at the time period that follows that. Renaissance literally means rebirth. So we see a period that really rises out of a lot of turmoil where we had bubonic plague and we had the wars of the Crusades. The reason why Italy is such a strategic location for the birth of the Renaissance is because when Rome fell, Italy really reverted back to its past. Instead of being united, they broke back into independent kingdoms. You can see from this map that Rome is controlled by the Pope, so it's the Papal States, and then you have a few republics like Florence and Venice. Basically, these were independently ran. They had their own set of rules, they had their own set of rulers. And during the Middle Ages, we also see in Northern Europe an attempt to form independent kingdoms. Italy really sets itself apart because it uses its geography to its credit. It is surrounded by water, so it makes a lot of its money through trade, while people in the north were focusing on agriculture and farming. So their money that is coming in is coming from different sources. Also, I want to introduce the term of a universal or a Renaissance man. This is a term that really does apply to this period, particularly when we begin talking about its many famous artists such as Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. The actual starting place of the Renaissance, interestingly enough, it's not in Rome, it's in Florence. The reason that Florence is really the birthplace is because of the man that you see shown below here, Lorenzo de' Medici. His family, the Medicis, had the largest bank in Europe, and they were one of the wealthiest families. And they were able to hire a lot of artists to come to Florence and to create these beautiful pieces that made their city look so much more beautiful than other areas. They were actually called the New Athens, which if you remember from our Greek lecture, I talked about Pericles, who helped bring in funds from the Delian League. It's the same concept, except for the Medicis are using a lot of their own personal money to do so. Now, Lorenzo, he was known as the Magnificent, and this is a term that he actually called himself. It's not a term that was applied years down the road. And the best way I can describe the Medicis to you is they really are kind of an early example of a mafia family. The reason I say mafia is because even though they were not elected to any official positions, they ran Florence behind the scenes. They used bribery, they used threats to get their way. So in a lot of ways, they do resemble kind of a very early mafia family. The best story that I actually have for you in relation to Lorenzo is what is known as the Pazzi conspiracy. Not everybody was so in love with the Medicis, and one of them was actually the Pope at the time. His name was Pope Sixtus IV. He actually was involved in a murder conspiracy to take out the Medicis so that he could gain a lot more influence in the region of Florence. He really took advantage of a family named the Pazzis, who were a rival banking family, so they really hated the Medicis. And what they did is that they put together a murder plot. The location where the murder was to take place was actually a church. Lorenzo and his family attended Mass every week, so they knew for sure that he would be there. The conspirators hid in the shadows, and when Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano entered the cathedral, they literally stepped out and they began stabbing them with knives. Giuliano was actually fatally wounded, but Lorenzo was able to fight off the attackers and he escaped through a side door. The conspirators were caught because the people who witnessed this were quite angry that anyone would come into a church of God and actually attack somebody. So it's just kind of an interesting part of their history that a pope actually tried to have them killed. The final result is that Lorenzo actually passed a law in Florence that stated that it was illegal to attempt to assassinate him. The main philosophy that belongs to the Renaissance is known as humanism. Humanism is an attempt to focus on the spirit of the individual. Now, the Greek and Roman philosophy had really been lost during the Middle Ages. So during the Renaissance, they actually rediscovered it. They began looking at the work of people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So humanism is not really focused on traditional Catholic faith. It's actually a rejection of the dogma that was being used by the church, and they began looking to their past for inspiration. What is really great about humanism is this focus and emphasis on the individual. The chart that I have on the right is known as a chain of being, and a traditional chain of being is a hierarchy where you are placed according to your social class. So for example, in the Middle Ages, you would probably have the king at the top, you would have lords or nobility under him, you might have a priesthood next, and slowly you work yourself down to a serf. The Renaissance chain of being is really different, because what they're going to ultimately argue is that the everyday normal person is capable of actually changing their social position. So you could have an artist who is born poor and they use their gifts as an artist to rise up through the social ladder and to earn wealth and fame. It's a very interesting philosophy, because when we talk about Renaissance man, this is really what we're talking about. We're talking about humanism, which really feeds on the spirit of each individual person and what they can contribute to their era. Of course, when you talk about the Renaissance, everyone immediately goes to the wonderful artwork that survived. And I want to introduce you first to what is very innovative about Renaissance painting for the era. It's the idea that they rediscovered not just Greek and Roman philosophy, but also how Greeks and Romans created their artwork. The Middle Ages really had very few uses for the Greek and Roman innovations. In fact, their paintings were very flat and very two-dimensional. They were focused much more on emotion than on realism. Also, the sculpture pieces were not freestanding. They actually were a part of the building of the church itself. So during the Renaissance, they rediscovered how to make painting very realistic and also three-dimensional. It is by perspective, which seems to be a very simple idea now, but at the time it transformed art. What you do is that you want to take your canvas and you want to place objects in your canvas where they look realistic and they're proportioned correctly. How you do that is you pick an area in your canvas that is known as a vanishing point. Everything meets to that point. So for example, if you are painting a landscape, you would want to have objects recede and get smaller and smaller as they reach the vanishing point. That makes it proportionally correct. Now, atmospheric perspective, I will show you with Leonardo da Vinci, who was really a master at using that. And without further ado, here is Mr. Da Vinci. Leonardo is probably one of the most famous of all of the Renaissance artists, and he is the best example of a true Renaissance man. Da Vinci was not simply an artist, he also was a writer, he was a historian, an inventor, a mathematician, and the list just goes on and on. He loved to explore every single subject that he literally could be exposed to, and it is reflected in his artwork. Something that is really interesting that survived is Da Vinci's notebooks. They're filled with all of his ideas of what this period could bring to the world. And what's really cool about it is that he even had sketches of inventions that it would take centuries to actually bring to life. For example, he had the idea for a helicopter. I mean, imagine that, 1400s, and this guy is talking about flying machines. He also has very famous sketches such as the Vitruvian Man that you see on the bottom left side. The idea that man is perfectly proportioned and beautiful. And the first example I'll show you of Da Vinci will show you how he very easily uses these innovations to create these wonderful images. Here is Da Vinci's Last Supper. The Last Supper was actually created for a cathedral, and it was painted on a wall, so it's a fresco painting. It was set right before you entered the dining room, so that monks, nuns, priests would be reminded of Jesus' last meal before they would take their own meals. In order to set the figures into the scene, Da Vinci uses a number scheme. He uses the number 3. You can see 3 windows behind the head of Jesus, and also the disciples are set into groupings of 3. He is very meticulous about detail. He actually pays very careful attention to the story here. Now, at the Last Supper, it is revealed that Jesus is betrayed by one of the disciples, and we know that that is Judas. Judas is seated at the table. If you count from moving from the left to the right, he is actually the 4th head that you see, but he's technically the 5th person sitting at this table. What is really interesting about the detail is that Judas's head is actually on a lower plane than anybody else sitting there. He also has a money bag in one of his hands, showing that he indeed has been paid for his betrayal. Also, his other hand is reaching for bread, and the only other person who is doing that at the same time is Jesus. That is what reveals Judas to indeed be the betrayal. But I could spend a lot more time revealing the insight that Dan Brown provided in Da Vinci Code, but that's really just a myth, and I won't spend too much time doing that. Mona Lisa is without a doubt the most famous painting that Da Vinci ever completed, and it's probably also one of the most famous paintings in the entire Western world. Mona Lisa is actually quite small as a portrait. Any one of us could hold her in our hands. I think we have this idea that she's huge, but she's actually very tiny. This is where I was talking about the use of atmospheric perspective. Da Vinci called it sfumato, which means lost in smoke. What that is it's a hazy effect that you add to the background. So you can see in this painting that the background is a bit hazy. The reason he uses that is it is an easy way to blend the background to the foreground where they do not look like they're separate pieces. They actually fit together. He also used glazing, which is a technique where you build up color and make it bold and bright by using layers of oil paint. Now, Mona Lisa, I think, is really intriguing even today because of the woman that is shown here. It's her face. We're not quite sure if she's smirking or smiling. It's called a Mona Lisa smile. And also her eyes, they're crinkled at the edges. And she seems to be gazing almost at us, but almost quite off the canvas. So I think people are drawn in by her because they want to know more about who this woman is. For years, they actually did not know who she was. They today believe that she was the wife of a nobleman and that he had paid Da Vinci to actually complete her portrait. The next artist is Michelangelo. Michelangelo is considered to be a bit younger than Da Vinci, and he actually really did not like Leonardo. He was not a fan of him, probably just simply because he was a rival, and Michelangelo did not like to have rivals. I like to describe him as the diva of the Renaissance. The reason why is because of his true belief in his own abilities. In fact, his entire philosophy is Neoplatonism. This is a Greek and a Roman philosophy, and what it basically states is that there are hidden truths. You can say it's the mystery of life that we don't understand, and there are individuals who can use their art to actually imitate these mysteries. So for example, if he painted in a canvas about creation, he would probably argue that his completed work is as close to God's creation as anything you will ever see. So that tells you right there, he's a bit egotistical. He also was a devout Catholic, so we do get a lot of religious art from Michelangelo. He does epitomize the word terabilita, which means that he believed that he was the only authority of his own artwork, that he was the only one who could properly judge his pieces. I think without a doubt that the Sistine Chapel is his most famous work. It is a fresco ceiling painting. The Sistine Chapel is located at the Vatican in Rome, and it is still used today when they conclave to elect a new pope. They go into the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling painting, when you look at it, I mean, it is just extraordinary. There are over 300 figures that are in this piece, and it is focused on the story of the Old Testament. Michelangelo actually was very reluctant to take on this work. He considered himself, very surprisingly, to be a sculptor, not really a painter. So when they asked him to come and do this, he was actually working on a very grand piece. He was working on the Pope's tomb, and he did not want to be pulled away from it. He eventually agreed, but he only did so if he had total creative control over the work. So it began as being very small, and it ended up being this huge work that not only incorporates stories from the Old Testament, but it incorporates architecture. We have figures pointed in all directions. The easiest way to understand its layout is to see it in this format as a chart. What we are concerned with are the central panels working from the right going to the left. Basically, he takes the story of creation. He begins with God's creation of the world. Those are the first 3 panels. When we get to the middle panels, this is the creation of man and woman. The creation of Adam is probably the most famous panel, but then we have the creation of Eve, and then when Adam and Eve are cast out from the Garden of Eden. To complete this trio of panels, we have the story of Noah and Noah's Ark with the Great Flood. And the reason Michelangelo stops after Noah is because when the flood is complete, there is a new covenant created with God. Now, surrounding these central panels, he does include not just biblical figures, but also figures from Greek and Roman history. So he's actually playing with mythology and also with religion. Here is that famous central panel, the creation of Adam, and people usually know the hands that are almost touching. If you look at the difference in body language, Adam is actually laying on the earth. That's why we have blues, greens, and browns for the color. And he is laying there and he's very lethargic in his body language, almost lazy. God, on the other hand, is so dynamic. He is flowing in the wind, like he's flying in at rapid speed. And we see that with how his gown is actually blowing. Now, of course, you're probably wondering what in the world is actually located behind God. What is behind him has been looked at as the gifts that he bestows upon Adam. One of the theories is that God's arm is actually around Eve, and that these other images could be free will. That could be the symbolism. What they're encased in does look like either a heart or a brain. But there is a huge difference that I want you to note in how their body language is presented. God being the much more powerful dynamic force, and Adam being just, like I said, very lethargic in how he is presented. I always feel that I would do a disservice if I did not show you Michelangelo's other work that is in the Sistine Chapel. It is known as The Last Judgment, and you can actually see the beginnings of his Sistine ceiling at the very top of it. This was done much later in Michelangelo's life. And the Last Judgment is, of course, Judgment Day, when people are either saved or they are damned. This is another very interesting, complex piece. And he does integrate religion and Greek mythology because the divide is right in the center. The top half is the people who will be saved. The bottom half are the damned, and he actually plays on the Greeks' version of the underworld to do this. Looking up close at a few of these images, we see at the very top that we have Jesus. Jesus stands out because there is a glowing light right behind him. Who is tucked into his side is his mother, Mary. And then on the right-hand side, we actually have one of the saints whose bodies will be restored. Saints often were persecuted for their faith, which is how they gained their martyrdom or their sainthood. This is actually Bartholomew. And what's interesting to show about this is that he has removed his skin that had been burned while he was alive. The face of Bartholomew's removed skin, they believe today that it is actually Michelangelo, that he included a self-portrait. I will explain why he would pick such a bizarre thing to use for his portrait. The bottom part of the panel is where we see the Greek underworld. The man who is standing with an oar, looks like he's ready to swing at the damned. That is Charon, who is the ferryman in Greek mythology that transports the dead across the river Styx. What is the best story about the Last Judgment is that while Michelangelo was working on it, the Catholic Church was undergoing a revision in regards to art, particularly obscenity in art. They began to view nudity as being very offensive. Now, Michelangelo painted in the Greek and Roman tradition where figures are often seen in the nude, and it is not considered vulgar. The church began to change their standpoint, and what happened is they began what is known as a fig leaf campaign, meaning that they ran around and they covered up nudity with fig leaves, or in painting, they would cover them with drapery. We actually see this in the Last Judgment because there's drapery covering Jesus's lower half. Now, Michelangelo did not like people to alter his art or really to critique it. He actually faced a lot of criticism as he, for example, he received this letter from a poet. It said, speaking about the Last Judgment, that your art would be at home in some voluptuous bagnia, certainly not in the highest chapel in the world. What a bagnia is, it is a brothel. So you can see why this is very insulting. He also was being criticized by a lot of cardinals who were working at the Vatican. One in particular apparently got very defensive with Michelangelo, and he took great offense to this. Michelangelo decided, in his very dry sense of humor, to include a portrait of this cardinal in his Last Judgment piece. And here is this lovely man. The cardinal, as you see, he is placed among the damned in hell. And he has been given donkey ears, so we know exactly what Michelangelo is saying about him. And he has covered his nudity with a serpent. The cardinal, when he saw this, he immediately started flipping out. He complained formally to the Vatican. He demanded that Michelangelo remove his image. And what is so great about this story is that a lot of the other cardinals thought that it was hysterically funny. And they actually told him that we have no jurisdiction over hell, so you're just going to have to remain there. So if you ever visit the Sistine Chapel today, please do look for this cardinal who has donkey ears. He is still there. I want to show you a few examples of sculpture art because sculpture was rediscovered during the Renaissance. This is the most innovative transformation it had undergone since the classical period. We do get a lot of focus on humanism. These are individuals that are being highlighted, and there is great use of proportion and balance, also a lot of movement. The first artist I want to use is Donatello. He is an early Renaissance artist, and I want to show you how an artist can take the same subject matter and portray it in two entirely different ways. David has been sculpted by many different artists. Donatello's version is quite interesting. He actually was commissioned to do the work by Florence, particularly the Medici family. And there is an inscription that was included that states, "The victor is whoever defends the fatherland. All-powerful God crushes the angry enemy. Behold, a boy overcame the great tyrant. Conquer, O citizens." David, of course, defeated the giant Goliath, and I think we understand why this inscription is powerful. It's basically symbolic. It's stating that if you take on Florence, you may underestimate us, but remember when a boy overcame a great tyrant. It is a piece of propaganda. The best way to really view David is to see him from all different directions. Now, when I teach this in class, students often note that David looks very feminine, and I would agree with that assessment. He definitely is a boy instead of a man here. He is much curvier in how he is sculpted. I think it's his stance. The real part of this piece for Donatello is that he is actually very accurate. David was actually very young when he fought Goliath. I think he emphasizes that. This is captured post-battle, which is why we see the head of Goliath at the very bottom. David is actually standing on him with his foot. To show you how you can portray this entirely different, look at Michelangelo's version of David. His David is 17 foot tall. It is also in Florence, and it was done for Florence. His David, I think we would agree, probably looks more masculine than Donatello's. He also pays great attention to detail. I mean, look at the close-up pictures of his hand and his face. You can see the veins running up his hand. And I mean, remember again, this is marble that he's transforming. Also, his face, that stare is so intense. His brow is furrowed as he is looking at his enemy. Michelangelo actually captured this before the battle begins. So the intense stare is probably mental preparation. When you see it put up against Donatello's, I mean, they are entirely night and day difference. It's not just simply that Donatello's is sculpted in bronze and Michelangelo's is sculpted in marble. It's the portrayal of the Davids. They come across entirely different in their body language and how they are looking at the viewer. Now, this is going to end our discussion on the Renaissance era. So you have been introduced to a lot of the art, a bit of the philosophy, and we are going to move from here to a whole different period that also plays with a lot of these ideas.